Jon Snow had always felt like an outsider in Winterfell, though the Stark children treated him with care in their different ways. Robb as a friend, Bran with honest curiosity, Arya with a kind of kinship, and Sansa with a guarded politeness. He remained acutely aware that he had no rightful claim to the name Stark. Bastard, they called him. There were times when he wondered if the cruelty of that label was sharpened by his own father's silence regarding his mother. A silence so persistent and complete that Jon would lie awake at night imagining the possibilities. The truth was always just out of reach, and though he'd learned to live with the emptiness, it ached with every whisper of Snow. Lord Eddard Stark was an honorable man, known throughout the Seven Kingdoms for his unwavering sense of duty. Yet his commitment to that sense of duty kept secrets locked deep within him. Secrets that he had carried for nearly 17 years, secrets that weighed upon him whenever he looked at his taciturn, gray-eyed son. For all his Lord Father's unspoken care, Jon grew into a reserved young man, always setting himself apart from others by choice because it hurt too much to feel the weight of their pity. His skill with the sword was an escape, his conversations with Robb a fleeting joy, and his bond with Arya a reminder that not everyone scorned him. Winterfell was the only home he knew, but he remained uncertain whether his presence there truly belonged. On a bitterly cold day when the snows outside Winterfell's walls glistened more brightly than the winter sun, Jon found himself alone in the Godswood, kneeling by the weirwood tree. The white bark and red leaves were a stark contrast to the lightly falling snow. He always liked to come here to pray or to just think because the old gods did not judge him. He sometimes whispered his hopes and fears beneath the carved face of that ancient tree. When he closed his eyes, he tried to imagine what his future would look like. A portion of him accepted that he was headed for the Wall, to serve in the Night's Watch, as that was a traditional path for highborn bastards. A life of duty and little glory, a chance to forge an identity beyond the scornful name, Bastard. He did not resent it. At times, he welcomed it. Yet, on this particular day, Ned Stark watched from a distance, half concealed among the red-leafed branches. He listened to the low murmur of his son's prayer. Jon was asking the old gods for purpose, something to fill the emptiness that Ned's silence had created in him. The Lord of Winterfell closed his eyes against a sudden pang of guilt. The young man was nearly 17, and still he knew not a single detail of his mother's identity. Eddard realized the choice he had been putting off for so long was crushing Jon's sense of belonging. For Jon to go to the Wall without knowing the truth of his lineage felt like a terrible betrayal of the boy's trust. And yet, to reveal that truth could reshape not just Jon's life, but the course of the realm. Late that evening, after the rest of the castle had settled into the hush of night, Ned paced the length of his solar, brooding over a worn piece of parchment from King Robert. It was short, but its message was weighty. The king would soon depart King's Landing for Winterfell, bringing half the court with him, to name Ned Stark as Hand of the King. The realm was in political upheaval, and Robert sought the steadiness of his old friend. Ned had just received the Raven earlier in the day, and the knowledge that the king's presence was imminent brought old secrets lurching to the surface. If Robert Baratheon discovered what Ned had hidden all these years, he would no doubt be furious, perhaps even violent in his reaction. Ned shivered despite himself, thinking of the terror Robert still held for any Targaryen. But in that moment, Ned also understood that he might be running out of time. Jon had asked to join the Night's Watch. The boy seemed to think it was the only place for him. It meant honor in the face of the scorn bastards received. Ned had to decide quickly, before the king's arrival, whether to confide in Jon the truth of his parentage. If it came to light through any other means, the risk to Jon would be unimaginable. Besides, wasn't it time for the young man to understand why Ned had gone to such lengths to keep him safe? Eddard Stark's footsteps echoed on the cold stone floor of Winterfell's lower corridors. His candle sputtered, sending flickering shadows across the walls. His heart was heavy with the possibility that he was about to place an even greater burden upon Jon's shoulders. But he could not let the boy simply walk away to take the black without so much as a hint of his heritage. He did not want Jon to carry false assumptions that he was the product of some nameless liaison. In the end, Ned's sense of honor compelled him to the door of Jon's small bedroom, a modest chamber near the barracks. Ned had not come here often after Jon outgrew childhood. He did not wish to stir envy or suspicion among the other children, or even among the lords and ladies that frequented Winterfell. But tonight, father and son needed to speak plainly. Jon was awake, as he often was, lost in thought. He was seated near a single candle on his rough-hewn desk, studying an old book of northern legends. The knock on his door startled him. Seldom did anyone come here at this hour. He stood, pulling on a simple woolen shirt over his linen undershirt, and opened the door to see his father. "Lord Stark," he said quietly, reflexively lowering his head in deference. Ned sighed. He had never liked the tension that thickened the air between them whenever the trappings of their relationship as lord and bastard forced themselves in. He motioned for Jon to sit. Then he closed the door softly behind him and took a seat on the edge of Jon's modest bed. He carefully placed the candle on a small table. Its warm light danced across Jon's face, revealing the boy's confusion and a hint of concern. "Jon," he began, voice just above a whisper. "There is something you must know, something I should have told you before, but I was afraid." Fear flickered across Jon's countenance. In that moment, hundreds of possibilities flooded his mind. Was he about to learn of his mother? And if so, would the truth be ugly? Or was Ned going to forbid him from joining the Night's Watch? Perhaps the news was even more dire, though he could not imagine what that might be. Ned spoke haltingly, with the measured pace of a man carefully stepping over broken glass. He described the war against the Targaryens, Robert's rebellion, the sack of King's Landing, and the final days that led to his own sister Lyanna Stark's death in the Tower. Through trembling words, he revealed that Jon's mother was not a common woman, nor was Jon the product of a momentary lapse in Ned's honor. Instead, he was the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, the crown prince slain on the Trident. Jon carried in him the blood of the dragon and the wolf. At first, Jon did not believe it. The shock on his face was so profound that Ned feared the boy might faint. But Jon did not collapse. Instead, he stood there, silent, eyes wide, as Ned continued the story. He explained how Lyanna had made him promise to keep Jon safe from Robert Baratheon's wrath, for Robert had sworn to destroy every last Targaryen. Ned, bound by his sister's dying wish, had taken the infant from the Tower of Joy and returned him to Winterfell under the pretense of fathering a bastard. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Those who did were either sworn to secrecy or long since dead. When Ned finished, the flickering candle between them seemed to hold its breath along with Jon. 100 heartbeats passed in silence, though each one felt like a thunderclap in Jon's ears. He stared at Ned, studying every subtle line of the man's face, searching for the slightest sign of dishonesty or jest. None was there. Lord Eddard Stark was not a man given to jokes of this nature, nor was he one to lie. Yet to believe that he was not Jon Snow at all but Jon Targaryen, though he barely recognized that name as his, made the world tilt on its axis. Finally, Jon found his voice, low and thick. "Why tell me now?" he asked, swallowing hard. Ned exhaled, as though he had been holding a mountain on his shoulders. "Because King Robert is coming. Because you want to leave for the Night's Watch. Because you deserve to know the truth of who you are, and what that might mean for you." Jon's mind spun like a maelstrom. He felt anger for being lied to all his life, gratitude that Ned had risked so much to save him, fear for what might come next, and grief for a mother he had never known, all swirling together like a tempest in his chest. He felt unsteady. Ned rose, placed a hand on Jon's shoulder, and for a moment, the fatherly gesture calmed him. But calmness gave way to a torrent of questions. "What does this mean? I am not your son," Jon blurted. His voice cracked in the hush of the small room. Ned shook his head. "I have raised you as my son, and in my heart, you will always be my son. You are also Lyanna's, my sister's child. I loved her more than words can say. I promised her I would protect you. It was the last promise she ever asked of me." Jon stood and took a step away. The candlelight seemed too bright, or perhaps his mind was so disordered that the world itself seemed uncertain. And Rhaegar Targaryen, was he? Jon found the words difficult to form. He had grown up on stories painting Rhaegar as a monstrous villain who kidnapped Lyanna. But hearing Ned's voice shake, seeing the sorrow behind his eyes, Jon sensed the truth might not be so simple. Ned did not speak ill of Rhaegar. Instead, he described a prince torn between duty and prophecy, a musician, a scholar, and a warrior who had believed in something greater than himself. The narrative was very different from what the realm's storytellers had woven after the rebellion. Still, Ned did not overly praise Rhaegar, for that man had been an enemy to the Starks. But neither did he demonize him. He let the truth lay bare. Rhaegar and Lyanna had loved each other, and their union, secret and dangerous, had borne Jon. "So I am the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, then?" Jon asked, bitterness creeping into his tone. "Is that what my life has amounted to? A hidden prince?" Ned's eyes flashed with worry. "Jon, no one must know. No one. Especially not Robert. If he even suspected the truth, your life would be forfeit. Robert's hatred for Targaryens is almost without limit. And if certain other powerful lords learned of your claim, you would become a pawn in their games. This secret must remain between us." Silence again took hold. In that deep hush, Jon thought about what it meant to be of Targaryen blood. The House Targaryen was nearly extinct, with only rumors of Viserys and Daenerys living across the narrow sea. And the fearsome stories of dragons, of madness, and of civil wars raged in his mind. Could he even call himself Jon Targaryen? It felt like a violation of everything he had known. He had grown up in the north, worshipped the old gods, learned the ways of the Starks. Winterfell was in his bones. And yet, he had a father he never knew, a mother he never got to meet, and a name he'd never used. Ned pressed a letter into Jon's hand. It was a letter from Howland Reed, whose trust had been unshakable since the days they fought together. The letter confirmed parts of Jon's parentage and spoke of Lyanna's last moments. Jon read the parchment with trembling fingers, tears threatening to fall. His mother, a Stark, had named him before she died. Perhaps he was part of both houses, after all, but recognized by none. Exhausted, overwhelmed, Jon sank onto his bed. He felt Ned's hand again upon his shoulder. "I know this is much," Ned said. "I do not expect you to accept it all at once. But I wanted you to know that I love you, in my own way. I always have. Please understand why I had to keep you secret." Jon's heart clenched. He believed Ned. He might wrestle with anger, but he could not deny the sincerity in his father's, his uncle's eyes. "I do," Jon whispered. "But what do I do now?" Ned had no simple answers to give. "We will figure that out. But first, you must swear to keep this knowledge between us. If the king knew, he would kill you. You are not safe if this truth is revealed. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I will speak with you more of this when you are ready. I only ask that you speak of it to no one. Not even Robb, not even to your sisters." Jon swallowed the lump in his throat. He had always wanted to know the truth about his mother. Now that he had it, he felt as though it might be the end of his world. "I promise," he said softly. Ned nodded. Then he reached out to gently clasp Jon's face between his hands, as though he were a child again, though his calloused palms trembled with emotion. "You are a Stark too in your heart," he said. "Remember that." With that, Lord Eddard Stark left, his own candlelight fading into the corridors. Jon sat in the darkness, stunned, until the candle burned low and the flame extinguished itself. Eventually, he rose and walked to the small window that looked out on the courtyard of Winterfell. The swirl of snow was peaceful, mesmerizing. Jon rested his forehead against the cold stone. He realized he was shaking. The knowledge that he was a Targaryen, of all things, lodged itself in his mind. He was the heir to a dynasty that had once ruled the Seven Kingdoms with dragons and steel. He was also a living threat in the eyes of King Robert. The two facts would have been inconceivable to him that very morning. Sleep did not come easily. When he awoke the next day, the sun was already well above the horizon. He heard Robb's laughter somewhere in the yard, Arya's voice drifting through a corridor, and felt the normal rhythms of Winterfell continuing. Yet everything had changed for Jon, though only he and Ned Stark knew it. It was as if he inhabited an entirely different castle now. Even the walls and hallways he had known his whole life seemed to hide secrets in their shadows. Jon went about his tasks as usual. He sparred in the yard with Robb, their wooden swords clacking in a familiar rhythm. He noted Theon Greyjoy's smirk, ever present, and the slight disinterest from the men-at-arms. To them, Jon was simply the bastard. Nothing had changed from their vantage point. Jon realized that to keep himself and those he cared about safe, he needed to appear as though nothing at all was amiss. So he forced himself to laugh when Robb teased him for an awkward thrust, forced himself to eat in the great hall with the other wards and younger men, listening half-heartedly to Theon's boastful stories of the Iron Islands. Inside, the storm of revelation churned. His eyes lingered on the House Stark sigils, the dire wolf banners. Part of him felt an even stronger bond to the wolf, knowing that his mother had been a Stark and that Winterfell truly was his home in many ways. At the same time, he was something else entirely, something that might burn away all that he loved if discovered. That evening, while walking back from the armory, Jon found himself pausing at the crypts of Winterfell. The heavy door stood before him like an invitation to a secret he only now half understood. He had come here sometimes before, alone or with Robb, or sometimes even following Arya's curious footsteps. The quiet stone corridors with the statues of dead kings and lords of winter left a solemn impression on him. Lyanna Stark had a tomb there. How many times had he passed it without knowing it was his mother's final resting place? He slipped inside quietly. The corridor was lit by sparse, guttering torches, and the cool, stagnant air greeted him like a ghost's breath. His footsteps echoed off the carved pillars and stone floors, each step feeling more significant than ever before. Finally, Jon came to Lyanna's statue. She was depicted as a young woman, her stone figure gentle yet solemn, with a wreath of winter roses in her lap. Ned often left flowers here, though seldom did Jon see him do so. Now, with the truth laid bare, Jon felt an odd intimacy with the figure. This was his mother, though he had never known her. He knelt, head bowed. Tears threatened his eyes. He wanted to speak but found no words. The only thought that emerged was a single question. Why? Why did the gods take her? Why did they leave him to live in confusion and half-truths for so long? Why was he cursed with a name and heritage he couldn't fully claim? The crypt's silence offered no answers. As Jon stood to leave, a faint whisper of movement made him turn, heart pounding. He saw a shape recede into the darkness. A flicker of candlelight revealed it to be Ned Stark. The man lingered at the edge, as if giving Jon privacy. Jon nodded to him, unsure what to say, and left the crypt. Ned remained, paying his respects, or perhaps steeling himself for the challenge of explaining to Robert that he had no Targaryens hidden under his roof. In the days that followed, Jon wrestled with his next steps. He had planned to ask Ned to allow him to join the Night's Watch. Now everything was uncertain. Could he hide as a black brother among the crows, safe from Robert's wrath and the intrigues of the realm? Or did this newly discovered parentage change his path entirely? He found himself wandering the halls, lost in thought. One morning, as Jon was feeding Ghost, a runt of a dire wolf by size, but fiercely loyal, he decided to confide at least part of his turmoil to Samwell Tarly, an awkward new arrival who had come to Winterfell in advance of a journey to the Wall. Sam was the sort who listened well, though Jon had to be careful not to reveal too much. Jon needed a friend who might offer some comfort. Over time, Jon had begun to see Sam's gentle heart, his keen mind, and the empathy that shone behind his frightened eyes. But Ned's warning was absolute. The fewer who knew, the better. So Jon confided only his doubts about leaving Winterfell. He spoke vaguely of a secret that forced him to question whether the Wall was the best place for him. Sam, still so unsure of himself, still fearful of his own father, Randyll Tarly, offered words that were both cautious and tender. "I can't pretend to know your burdens, Jon," Sam said, glancing away nervously. "But I do know that if there's any doubt in your heart, You should wait until it's clear. The Night's Watch is a lifetime commitment. You can't easily take it back." Jon considered the words. He had wanted to flee from a place where he felt he didn't belong. Yet now, armed with the knowledge that he was a Targaryen by birth, the perspective had changed entirely. Perhaps the best thing he could do to remain safe and keep everyone else safe was to vanish into the ranks of the Black Brothers, letting the name Snow remain in obscurity. But a small voice inside him whispered that to run from this heritage was an act of cowardice. He also wondered, if his parentage were discovered while he was sworn to the Night's Watch, what chaos would that unleash? Winterfell soon roared to life with the arrival of King Robert, Queen Cersei, and their retinue. The courtyard was filled with horses, knights, lords, ladies, and small folk. The king embraced Ned in a boisterous hug, though Jon noticed a subtle tension in his father's posture. A line of royals entered the great hall, and all of Winterfell's household was gathered to greet them. Jon stood off to one side, among lesser lords and ladies, aware of his place as a bastard. Ghost remained outside, as the presence of a direwolf might be ill-received by the visitors. He watched as Robert Baratheon, large and still imposing though gone a bit to fat, clasped Ned's shoulder and boomed about how long it had been since they'd seen each other. Then the king's gaze took in the crowd, eventually falling on Jon. Robert lingered a moment, as if noticing the boy's dark hair and the shape of his face, then turned away without comment. Jon felt a chill, for he knew Robert had just glimpsed the secret he carried. Though the man seemed not to recognize it, a moment of terror passed through Jon's heart like ice water. Over the following days, feasts were held. Robert hunted in the nearby forests, sometimes with Robb and Theon in tow. Sansa and Arya accompanied the queen, albeit with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Jon tried to keep to the background, but there were times when he was forced to interact. Once, at a grand feast, Jon was placed near the foot of the main table, close enough to see the royal family. He noticed the tension between the king and queen, the watchful gaze of the hound standing behind Prince Joffrey, the bored sneer on the prince's face. Cersei barely regarded Jon at all, but Robert's eyes wandered occasionally toward him, and each time, Jon felt his breath catch. Perhaps the king simply found the boy's presence unusual, or maybe he was searching for a resemblance to Ned. But Jon could not shake the dread that Robert's suspicious nature might sense something amiss. During one of these feasts, Jon excused himself early, feeling suffocated by the noise and pomp. He slipped out into the courtyard, the cool northern air a welcome relief. Ghost padded silently at his side. Jon's heart pounded. Memories of Ned's warning echoed in his mind, how Robert would kill him if the truth came to light. Leaning against a pillar, Jon tried to steady his breathing, to find some semblance of calm. The fate of houses Targaryen, Stark, Baratheon, Lannister, all felt poised on a knife's edge, and Jon was that knife, however unwilling. The next day, as the king and Ned walked the grounds with various lords, Jon tried to keep his distance. He noticed, however, that Robert beckoned him over. With a quick glance to Ned, who wore a stoic expression, Jon approached. Ghost was nowhere to be seen, likely lingering by the butchering area for scraps. "I hear you're Ned's bastard," Robert said, blunt as ever. His voice carried no kindness nor particular malice, just a frank statement. Jon bowed his head. "Aye, your grace," he replied, hoping his tone was respectful. "I hear you handle a sword well," Robert continued. "The bastard of Winterfell, then. Are you set to join the Night's Watch? As I've heard." Jon's throat tightened. He forced himself to nod. "Yes, your grace. That is my intention." Robert chuckled. "Ah, a life of celibacy and watch duty. You're sure about that, boy? The realm is full of other opportunities." There was a hint of teasing in his voice, but it carried a certain cruelty. Ned attempted to guide the king's attention elsewhere, but Robert seemed oddly fixated on Jon. The king reached out and ruffled the boy's dark curls, in a strangely paternal gesture that made Jon's skin crawl. "Well, if that's where you belong," Robert said, laughing, "I suppose we'll see you dressed in black soon enough." He dismissed Jon with a wave of his meaty hand, turning back to a conversation with Ned about the plans for the royal feast that night. Tension drained from Jon as he backed away. He sensed Ned's eyes on him, filled with an apology that could not be spoken. If only Robert knew, Jon thought grimly. If only he knew whose blood ran in my veins. Yet the secret remained safe for now. That evening, another feast was held. Jon stayed only briefly, his mind too crowded to enjoy the festivities. He slipped out, considering a trip to the crypts again, to whisper unspoken confessions to his mother's tomb. But as he passed through the courtyard, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was Uncle Benjen, Ned's younger brother, a man of the Night's Watch. Benjen, a ranger of the Watch, had arrived with the king's procession to discuss matters of the North and the wildlings. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with a confidence that Jon had always admired. Jon greeted him respectfully, but Benjen beckoned him closer, leading him away from the prying ears of any passers-by. "You're restless," Benjen observed, crossing his arms. "I've seen you pace these yards at night, nephew. I know you've been considering the black." Jon nodded, trying to keep the swirl of secrets within him calm. Benjen regarded him intently. "I came here hoping to speak with you. If you truly wish to join, I'll see you escorted safely to the wall. But you should know that life on the wall is not some grand adventure. There's hardship, isolation, duty without end. You must be certain." Jon forced a half-smile. "I appreciate your concern, Uncle, but you know what it's like for me here." He tried to speak carefully, not letting slip the new truths that had drastically altered his perspective. "I'm a bastard. I have no place, no inheritance. The Watch is an honorable path. At least, it's always seemed so." Benjen pursed his lips. "The Night's Watch is not what it was in the old tales, Jon. It's a shadow of its former self, filled with criminals and runaways. Only a handful keep the vows for the sake of honor. I'm one of them, but it's a lonely thing." He studied Jon for a long moment. "You can still have a life, a future, here in Winterfell or elsewhere. You needn't seal yourself to the cold and darkness beyond the wall just because you feel out of place." Jon hesitated. Days earlier, his certainty had been unshakable. He wanted to leave behind the stigma of being Ned Stark's bastard. Now, the entire world had changed. For an instant, he felt like telling Benjen the truth, that he was no bastard at all, but the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. That the Night's Watch might be the only place to hide from King Robert's fury if the secret ever came out. But Ned's warning rang in his head. So he merely said, "I need time. I'm not so sure anymore." Benjen nodded. "Take what time you need." He gripped Jon's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'll stand by you. You're my blood, Jon. And your father. Your father has always cared for you in his way." Benjen's words made Jon flinch inwardly. Even Benjen believed Ned to be Jon's father. So many well-intentioned lies wrapped around him like a cloak. In the nights that followed, Jon wrestled with his choice. On one hand, if he joined the Night's Watch, he could remain Jon Snow, an insignificant bastard in the eyes of the realm, safe from the prying eyes of King Robert. He would swear off lands, titles, and the messy intrigues of lords and ladies. He might find a sense of belonging among outcasts. But on the other hand, part of him questioned whether it was right to walk away from the legacy his mother and father had left him. Whether it was dangerous or not, the truth of who he was beckoned him with quiet insistence. Could he ignore a birthright that might one day matter to the realm? Events soon forced his hand. One late afternoon, a dispute broke out in the courtyard between Arya and Prince Joffrey after Arya's small friend, the butcher's boy, was sparring with her by the riverside. Joffrey had intervened cruelly. It all escalated until the king demanded a hearing of sorts in the Great Hall. The entire court gathered. Sansa was weeping, Arya was defiant, Cersei was incensed, and Robert was half-drunk, clearly annoyed at having to deal with such trivial matters. Jon stood off to the side, arms tense at his sides. When it was all done, the butcher's boy was found dead, presumably at the hound's hand, and the king ordered that Arya's direwolf be put down. Nymeria had run off, but they took Lady instead, Sansa's direwolf. Jon watched the coldness in Cersei's eyes, the resignation in Robert's, the heartbreak in Sansa's, and recognized, perhaps for the first time, the cruelty that could come from the Iron Throne. He thought of how that cruelty could be turned on him if Robert ever learned who he really was. The king did not hesitate to kill a beast simply to appease Cersei and quell the chaos. That same king would not hesitate to kill a boy he suspected of Targaryen blood. After that grim event, Jon's mind returned to the question of the Night's Watch. If there were any place he might remain out of Robert's reach, it was behind the wall. But every time the vow came to his tongue, "Night gathers and now my watch begins." He saw an image of Lyanna's statue, heard the echo of Ned's voice, remembering the love that had brought him into the world. Did he owe it to them to live as more than just a bastard hidden in the shadows? If the Targaryen line died with him, would that be a betrayal of the mother he had never known? He found himself returning nightly to the crypts, as if seeking guidance from Lyanna. Once, Ned joined him silently. For a time, they said nothing. Then Ned spoke quietly, voice reverberating through the stillness. "I see the conflict in your eyes, Jon. If you wish to take the black, you will have my blessing. I will find a way to keep you safe even there. But if you do not, then I will not force you." Jon turned, voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what I should do. I hate living a lie, but if the truth comes out..." He trailed off, glancing at the cold stone face of his mother's statue. "I'd be putting everyone in danger. You, my siblings, even myself." Ned placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. His expression was kind, but beneath that kindness lay a deep, inescapable sadness. "I will not deny it. Telling the realm the truth of your parentage would bring war. Robert would never allow a Targaryen to live, if he knew. There are too many who lost loved ones in the rebellion, and there are others who might rally to your banner, who believe the Targaryen line was the only rightful monarchy. That war would tear the realm apart." Jon swallowed hard, imagining thousands dying for a cause he had never asked for. "Then the Night's Watch is the only way," he murmured. Ned hesitated. "Not necessarily. You could remain here at Winterfell as you have. Or we could try to send you across the narrow sea, where any Targaryen name might be less of a death sentence. But that is not without danger either." Ned did not mention the rumored Viserys and Daenerys living in exile, but Jon knew of them. If Jon came to Essos claiming Targaryen blood, what chaos might that spawn? Days passed while Jon wrestled with the dilemma. Meanwhile, the rest of Winterfell buzzed with preparations. Robert was set to leave soon, with Ned traveling south to assume the role of Hand of the King. Rumor had it the Lannisters were unsettled by Ned's new position, tensions rising behind the polished surface of royal ceremony. Bran's accident, his mysterious fall, added further gloom over the castle, though no one suspected foul play except for Ned's wife, Catelyn, who was too consumed by her own grief and suspicions to notice Jon's changed demeanor. Arya, Sansa, and the others had their own struggles, but Jon was too lost in his to involve himself deeply. He found solace only in training his direwolf, Ghost, or occasionally exchanging a few words with Sam, who seemed perpetually terrified of his impending trip to the Wall. Jon realized that if he did indeed join, Sam might be one of his only true friends there. One day, Sam approached Jon and spoke in hushed tones near the armory. "I've decided," Sam stammered. "I'm going to the Wall. My father gave me no choice, but perhaps I can make something of myself there." He gave a shy, uncertain smile. "Will you be coming?" Jon looked at the boy, who was so earnest in his desire for acceptance. The question felt heavier than a millstone around his neck. He nodded slowly, though not definitively. "I'm leaning that way," he said, unsure if it was the truth. "But if I do, it won't be for a week or more. The king is leaving soon, and I might travel south with Lord Stark for a short time before heading to the Wall." It was a half-lie. Jon was still in limbo, but saying the words felt like they gave him some direction. That evening, Ned called Jon to his solar once more. Candlelight flickered over a map of the 7 kingdoms, its lines etched in careful detail. Ned's face was drawn with worry. Jon could sense the weight of decisions piling upon the man's shoulders. Ned motioned for Jon to take a seat. "The king rides south soon," Ned began, voice low, "and I must go with him. Catelyn will remain here to tend to Bran and manage Winterfell. I had hoped you might ride north with Benjen, if that is still what you desire. But I need to ask you one last time. Are you certain?" Jon stared at the map. He saw the wall etched in bold lines at the top, King's Landing far to the south, and Dragonstone off the eastern coast. The name Dragonstone had new meaning now. If he was truly a Targaryen, that island could be considered part of his legacy. The notion felt unreal, yet it tugged at some hidden corner of his mind. I think so," he said, voice unsteady. "I can't live like this, always in fear. Perhaps at the wall, at least I'll have a sense of purpose." Ned studied him for a moment. "It won't be easy. You must keep your identity locked away. Even among your brothers, you cannot risk revealing that you are anything other than Ned Stark's bastard." Jon's jaw tightened. "I understand." Ned looked away, expression pained. "I am sorry, Jon." "No," Jon said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Don't apologize. You did what you had to do. You saved my life. I won't forget that." He meant every word. For all the confusion and turmoil, he remained grateful that Ned had protected him from Robert's wrath. Ned's eyes softened. "Thank you, my boy. I will do all I can to ensure you have a chance to thrive in the Watch. Benjen will watch over you, though duty often calls him beyond the wall. He told me there are good men there, if you know where to look." Jon nodded. He stood, stepping forward to embrace Ned in a moment of unguarded emotion. "Thank you," he repeated quietly. The man had been his father in all but blood, though now Jon knew he was also an uncle, caretaker, and savior rolled into one. In that moment, none of it mattered except the bond they shared. The day the king and his retinue departed, the castle bustled with farewells and last-minute preparations. Arya grumbled about traveling in the company of Sansa and the court. Sansa seemed excited at the notion of courtly life, if still shaken by Lady's loss. Robb remained behind to prepare to rule Winterfell in Ned's absence, supported by Maester Luwin and Catelyn. Jon found himself hugging the younger siblings goodbye, receiving an especially tight embrace from Arya, who whispered fiercely that she wished he could come with her. She said she'd never forget him, bastard or not. Jon fought back tears. He loved Arya's spirit, and he would miss her more than words could say. As the king's column vanished through the gates, Jon found Benjen near the stables. Sam was there as well, looking both anxious and relieved that the wait was almost over. Jon took one last look at the fading royal entourage. He could see Ned's form in the distance, riding with Robert, banners flapping overhead. Was Ned glancing back, thinking about the boy he had protected for 17 years? Possibly. Jon would never know. Benjen signaled their own small party to mount. The time had come. If Jon was to hide from the realm's storms, the wall was the safest fortress. Jon mounted his horse, Ghost loping beside him. The black direwolf had grown considerably, and his red eyes gleamed with fierce intelligence. Then, with a gentle kick, Jon urged his horse forward, flanked by Benjen, Sam, and a few other recruits for the Watch. He left Winterfell behind. Though the first leg of their journey felt somber, Jon reminded himself that this was the path he had chosen. He had learned the truth of his birth. Now he took a decisive step toward forging his own future. A future as Jon Snow, a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, who secretly bore Targaryen blood in his veins. Perhaps the gods had a plan for him, or perhaps he was simply fleeing a destiny he was too afraid to claim. Only time would tell. The north stretched out before them, wide and wild, the wind cutting across their cloaks. Benjen led them on roads that twisted through frosted pines and rolling hills. Each night they made camp, small fires crackling under starlit skies. Jon found comfort in the wilderness, recalling the hunts he'd gone on around Winterfell, and the quiet sense of solace the broad northern vistas gave him. Sam, less adept at riding and complaining about saddle sores, was still determined, forging a camaraderie with Jon, that made the journey more bearable. As they traveled, Benjen occasionally quizzed them on the history of the Wall, the Oath, and the function of the Watch. He spoke of how many men arrived at the Wall with shameful pasts. Thieves, murderers, rapists, seeking to atone or simply avoid further punishment. But some were volunteers, men who believed in the Watch's ancient duty to guard the realms of men. Benjen was one of the latter, and he spoke passionately of the dangers that lurked beyond the Wall. Wildlings, wights, and worse, if the old stories were true. Jon listened gravely, realizing that, ironically, the Wall might become his fortress of anonymity. At night, by the flickering glow of the campfire, Jon found himself staring into the flames. He wondered if this was the fire of the dragon that lived in his blood. He had no illusions of controlling real dragons, those were said to be long gone. But sometimes he sensed a heat within him that contradicted the cold north wind. If it was merely imagination or something more, he could not say. Sam caught him brooding more than once, but mercifully asked no questions. The journey took several days. Eventually, they reached the last stretch of their ride. The Gift, a swath of land under the Watch's purview, leading to Castle Black. Snow thickened on the ground. The wind's chill seemed sharper, even as the sun cast a pale glow. Then, on the final day, they crested a hill and beheld the Wall. It was a vast, looming edifice of ice and stone that cut across the landscape like a frozen god's decree. Even from miles away, its sheer scale made Jon's heart pound. He had seen it before in fleeting glimpses, but now he gazed upon it with a new understanding, that this place would be his home. And it struck him as both majestic and forbidding. Castle Black lay at the base of the Wall, a cluster of dark towers and barracks, overshadowed by the immense height of the ice barrier. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. Men milled about, some in black cloaks, some in tattered clothing. A large stable, several wooden walkways, and various storerooms made up the settlement. Benjen pointed out different areas as they rode closer, explaining that recruits would undergo training in the courtyard, sleep in the common barracks, and eventually swear their vows before the weirwood in the haunted forest or in the sept, depending on which gods they followed. Jon felt a swirl of apprehension and determination. If he was to remain hidden, it would be here, among criminals, outcasts, and honorable knights alike, bound by oath. Perhaps it was the right place for him. Perhaps fate had no better refuge for a secret Targaryen. Sam looked around nervously, but Jon gave him a nod of reassurance. They stabled their horses and were soon greeted by Ser Alliser Thorne, the master-at-arms responsible for training new recruits. A sour-faced, embittered man, Thorne eyed them with thinly veiled contempt. "Fresh meat for the grinder," he muttered, barely hiding his sneer. Jon clenched his jaw, bracing himself for what lay ahead. Benjen, used to this, calmly introduced each of them: Jon Snow, Samwell Tarly, and these others. Jon was thankful that his name drew no particular attention, just another northern bastard. They were directed to the barracks, plain wooden structures that smelled of sweat, old straw, and damp. A few straw-stuffed mattresses and blankets awaited them. Sam looked around in dismay, but Jon patted his shoulder. "We'll make do," he said. An older steward made a quick introduction, informing them they'd receive their black attire after a short period of training and evaluation. In the dimness of that first night at Castle Black, Jon felt a subtle ripple of relief. He had arrived. For all the uncertainty and danger, there was a measure of safety here. King Robert and the intrigues of the South felt distant as the frigid wind howled past the thick stone walls. Perhaps he could stay hidden after all, live out his days as Jon Snow. He only had to ensure the name Targaryen never passed his lips. He only had to bury the truth as deeply as possible. Training began in earnest the next day. Ser Alliser Thorne wasted no time in pitting the newcomers against each other in a makeshift yard. With wooden swords, Jon found it easy to best many of the recruits who had never held a weapon properly. Sam fared far worse, quickly exposed as timid and untrained, which drew scorn from Thorne. But Jon noticed that not all recruits were incompetent. A bull-necked boy called Gren, and a wiry youth from Flea Bottom named PYP, showed potential. Over time, friendships began to form. Yet, Jon's skill set him apart. Thorne seemed to resent him for it, referring to Jon sarcastically as Lord Snow. Mocking his highborn style, Jon tried to ignore it, focusing on his technique, but old resentments flared within him. He had come here to escape scorn, only to find it again. Still, it was different here. The others, after witnessing his prowess, gradually approached him in the evenings, asking for tips. Despite his reservations, Jon taught them a few drills, corrected their stance. Sam especially needed help. His fear of fighting was palpable. Jon took him aside after the official training ended, carefully instructing him in how to hold the sword, how to block and parry. Sam's body shook with nerves, but Jon remained patient. Slowly, Sam improved. Still clumsy, still easily beaten in a real match, but at least less likely to embarrass himself in front of the cruel master-at-arms. A friendship grew stronger between them as a result. Time passed, day after day of drills and chores. Jon found a rhythm. At night, he sometimes climbed a portion of the wall to stand at one of the overlooks, staring out into the vast wilderness beyond. Ghost would accompany him, the white wolf's breath steaming in the chill air. Jon would look at the moonlight reflecting off the endless snows and wonder if destiny truly meant for him to hide here for the rest of his days. He thought of Ned's parting words, of Lyanna's final moments, of Rhaegar's legacy. Could a man simply deny his heritage forever? Or was that heritage something that would eventually find him, no matter how deeply he tried to bury it? Benjen came and went, leading ranging parties beyond the wall. He had little time to guide Jon further, though he occasionally checked in. On one such occasion, Jon admitted that his choice still weighed heavily on him. Benjen understood, but reminded him there was no going back once the vows were said. "You'll be giving up any claim to titles or lands," Benjen told him. "Though, with the right circumstances, you might choose not to speak your vows yet, if you're truly uncertain." But Jon was uncertain if that was even an option. Declining the vows too long could stir suspicion. Why would a bastard like him hesitate, especially after traveling this far? Thorne would only pounce on such indecision to humiliate him, and Jon had nowhere else to go if he refused. He dared not return to Winterfell for fear of exposing Ned's secret if questions arose. He could not wander the realm without coin or alliances. Essos was a distant land of unknown perils, and so Jon continued to train, day after day, forging alliances with Gren and PYP, protecting Sam from the worst of Thorne's abuse. In the evenings, he huddled in the barracks, telling stories of Winterfell to amuse them. He found that, for all the hardships, the Watchmen were forging a camaraderie born of shared struggles. It reminded Jon a bit of home, though the gloom of the wall cast a perpetual shadow over everything. Summer began to wane into the early signs of autumn. Though seasons in Westeros were unpredictable, a chill deepened in the air. Word reached Castle Black of unsettling events. Rumors of White Walkers, scattered sightings of the undead, though most dismissed it as wildling gossip. Ned Stark had sent messages from King's Landing, but the contents never reached Jon, as he was not an official member of the Watch yet, and no one thought to share them. Jon felt a pang, wishing he knew more of how Ned fared. Then one cold morning, the watchman on the eastern tower spotted something on the horizon. A horse without a rider. Alarm spread through the castle. Rangers were sent to intercept it. Jon felt his heart pound, fearing it might be Benjen's horse. Tense hours passed until the news was confirmed. It was indeed one of Benjen Stark's mounts, returned riderless. No sign of the ranger patrol that had gone north. Jon's blood ran cold. Had something happened to Uncle Benjen? Over the next few days, the Lord Commander Jeor Mormont organized search parties. Men murmured about the wildlings' increasing boldness. Some whispered darker rumors about the White Walkers, though few voiced it openly. Jon tried to volunteer for the search but was swiftly denied. He was still a recruit, unprepared for the dangers beyond the wall. Anger and fear warred within him. Benjen was his uncle, the only link to his father's family here, and Jon felt helpless. In the midst of this upheaval, The day came when a group of recruits was to swear their vows and join the watch officially. Jon was among them. He had dreaded this day, for it meant sealing his fate. As the time drew near, Sam found Jon pacing, jaw clenched, hands shaking. "Jon, are you all right?" Sam ventured, though the answer was obvious. Jon breathed heavily. "I can't stop thinking about Ben-Jen, and I can't stop thinking about secrets. Once I say these words, there's no going back." Sam patted his arm clumsily. "That's true, but maybe it's still the best option you have. Or the only one. You don't owe the rest of the realm your life, Jon." Sam had no idea how ironic that statement was, yet it steadied Jon somewhat. He realized that if he was to remain safe, to keep his family safe, he had to bury Jon Targaryen forever. Perhaps that was the cost of preserving the realm from war. So when the hour came, Jon stood with the others in the gods wood beyond the wall, near a white weirwood tree that glowed in the dim northern light. The wind sighed through the branches. The men formed a rough line, and Jeor Mormont, along with a few senior brothers, stood in solemn witness. One by one, the recruits repeated the ancient words. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come." Jon closed his eyes, speaking the words clearly, each syllable tasting of finality on his tongue. He reminded himself that this was the only way. The vow echoed in his mind. "I shall wear no crowns." He suppressed a bitter laugh at the irony. Then the vow was done. Jeor Mormont welcomed each new brother with a clasp of the arm. For Jon, Mormont's eyes held a flicker of respect. "You'll do well," the old bear said. "I see potential in you." Jon responded with a polite bow of his head, but inside, he was reeling. It was done. Jon Targaryen was as good as dead. In his stead stood Jon Snow, brother of the Night's Watch, a sword in the darkness. Part of him was relieved. Another part felt numb, as though he had just severed some essential piece of his soul. Perhaps that was the price of peace. That night, in the common hall where they celebrated the new brothers, Jon accepted pats on the back, cups of cheap ale, laughter from Gren and PYP. Sam beamed at him, relieved that they would serve together, forging a quiet alliance in the face of the cold. Despite the momentary camaraderie, Jon soon slipped out into the courtyard. Ghost followed, padding silently at his side. The moonlit yard was deserted. Jon looked up at the towering wall, ice shimmering like pale glass. He breathed the frigid air, letting it fill his lungs. He remembered the vow he had spoken just hours ago. Its words were now the bars of a cage around him, but he had chosen this cage. He told himself it was the best decision for all concerned. If the realm was ever to know peace, it was better that Jon Targaryen remain buried. Yet that night, as he lay in his hard bunk, listening to the snores of his new brothers, he dreamt of dragons and wolves in battle, flames melting ice, and a crimson banner bearing the three-headed dragon swirling in the wind. He saw a woman with dark hair, crying out his name, and a man with silver hair holding a harp. When he woke, sweat clung to his brow, and the faint glow of dawn seeped through the small, iced-over window. Ghost nuzzled him, as if sensing his turmoil. Jon stroked the wolf's fur, telling himself it was only a dream. But deep in his heart, he feared that no vow and no wall of ice could keep destiny from finding him if it truly willed it so. In the weeks that followed, Jon threw himself into the duties of the Night's Watch. He rose before dawn for weapons training, oversaw tasks in the kitchens or stables when assigned, stood guard on the wall during the night watches. The bitter cold sank into his bones, but he learned to endure it. There was some measure of pride in wearing the black cloak, a sense of brotherhood he had never fully found even in Winterfell. and yet the loneliness remained. The vow had not erased the knowledge locked in his heart. He scanned every raven that arrived, hoping for word of Benjen. The search parties had found no trace. Some muttered that Benjen and his men were likely dead, slaughtered by wildlings or worse. Jon refused to believe it. He held onto a slim hope that his uncle still lived. He also looked for any whisper of the troubles in King's Landing, Ned Stark's new role, the tensions with the Lannisters, or the presence of the king. News arrived only in fragments, often weeks old. He learned that Ned had come into conflict with the Queen's brothers, that tensions were high, and that King Robert was rumored to be heavily in debt. None of it made Jon feel better. In quieter moments, especially during the long night watches, Jon found his thoughts drifting to the notion that if his parentage ever came to light, it could upset the entire realm. He imagined Robert's rage, the Lannisters' manipulations, the chaos that would ensue if rival factions decided to make Jon a figurehead for a Targaryen restoration. People would die, perhaps many, and for what? A claim Jon had no desire to press. The realm was better off with him hidden away. Sometimes he caught Sam giving him curious looks, as though the portly boy sensed that Jon carried a deeper secret. Once, Sam approached him in the library, where Jon was idly flipping through a musty tome about the history of the Targaryen kings. Sam, peering over his shoulder, stammered, "Why you're interested in the Targaryens?" Jon snapped the book shut, clearing his throat. "Just reading about the conquest. They had dragons once," he said by way of explanation. Sam nodded, hesitating. "I read that Prince Rhaegar was quite the warrior, and a musician, too." Jon felt a twinge. He nodded curtly. "So the book says." Then he left quickly, not wishing to dwell on the subject. Sam looked after him, puzzled. The changing of the season brought colder winds, and rumors of trouble in the south multiplied. One chilly evening, a raven arrived with news that King Robert Baratheon was dead, killed in a hunting accident, or so the message claimed. The new king was Joffrey Baratheon. Men at Castle Black muttered in concern. The realm was sure to be in turmoil with Ned Stark in King's Landing. Jon's heart lurched. He wondered if Ned was safe. If Robert was dead, what would happen to Targaryen hunters or Targaryen claimants or to the realm itself? Days later, more news arrived that Ned Stark had been accused of treason. The new King Joffrey had him imprisoned. Jon reeled at the words scrawled on the parchment. Treason? Ned Stark was the epitome of honor. How could he be a traitor? The entire watch buzzed with speculation. Some insisted it was a Lannister plot. Others thought Ned had discovered some shocking secret that forced the crown's hand. Jon's blood ran cold at that possibility. Had Ned's secret about Jon's parentage been discovered? Was that the reason? In the yard, practicing archery, Jon's hands trembled on the bow. He loosed an arrow that flew wide of the target, prompting a snide remark from Ser Alliser. But Jon barely heard it. All he could think was that Ned might be in danger because of him. He recalled the vow, "I shall wear no crowns, and I shall not meddle in the affairs of the realm." But how could he stand idle while Ned Stark's life was threatened? Sam pulled Jon aside, face pale with worry. "Jon, are you all right?" Jon forced a nod, though his guts churned. "Yes, just worried for my family." Sam bit his lip. "But your vows. You can't desert. The Watch has to stay out of the realm's politics." He sounded apologetic, as though he knew how heartless it seemed. Jon drew a ragged breath. He was indeed bound by those vows. Desertion was punishable by death. And even if he fled, what could he do? March into King's Landing alone and demand Ned's release? He would only get himself killed, and possibly bring the secret of his parentage into the open. As tension grew in the realm, so it did in Jon's soul. He patrolled the wall at night, seeing only endless darkness beyond. Yet he felt that same darkness creeping into the south, overshadowing every notion of justice he once held dear. One morning, as the dawn light crept over the horizon, a fresh raven arrived with the blackest news yet. Ned Stark had been executed by King Joffrey, beheaded before a crowd, including Sansa and Arya. The message was short and official. For a moment, Jon simply stood there, the slip of parchment in his hand, not breathing, not moving. He reread it. Then, in a silent fury, he crumpled it in his fist. He did not weep. His sorrow was too deep for tears. His father, no, his uncle, but the only father he had ever known, was dead. Beheaded as a traitor by a vicious boy king. Jon's entire body trembled. The courtyard around him spun, and he heard a roaring in his ears. Men were murmuring, casting him concerned looks, but he cared not. Jon wanted to kill something, anything. He wanted to exact revenge for Ned Stark. But he was stuck behind the wall, bound by vows that forbade him from taking up arms in the wars of the realm. Ghost whined at his side, sensing his distress. Sam tried to approach, stammering words of condolence. Jon pushed past him, seeking the stables in a wild impulse. He would ride south, avenge his father, consequences be damned. But just as he reached for a horse's reins, PYP and Gren came running. They pleaded with him not to do anything rash. Sam's face contorted with fear and empathy. "They'll label you a deserter, Jon. They'll execute you too." Jon's hand shook on the saddle. He was so furious he could hardly think. In that moment, the vow he had taken felt like a chain around his throat. He had given up the right to defend his own father. He had surrendered to honor a code that now seemed hollow in the face of personal grief. Yet he could not ignore his father's final wish, that Jon remain safe from Robert's, now Joffrey's, wrath, and from the knowledge of who he truly was. If he rode south in a blind rage, he might end up exposing himself, dooming them all. PYP and Gren guided him back to the barracks, away from prying eyes. Sam hovered nearby, tears in his own eyes for the pain he saw in Jon. Jon sank onto his bunk, numbness overtaking the initial surge of anger. This was the cost of loyalty, the cost of secrecy, the cost of an oath to the Night's Watch. Ned Stark was dead, and Jon could do nothing. He pressed his face into his hands, letting out a ragged breath. That night, he dreamed again, of the Tower of Joy, of Lyanna Stark dying in a bed of blood, whispering, "Promise me, Ned." While Rhaegar's harp played a mournful tune in the background, he saw King Joffrey's sneering face dissolve into flames, and Robert's warhammer crashing down upon a silver dragon helm. He saw Ned's face, solemn and sad, asking forgiveness. Jon woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering. Ghost lay at his feet, eyes glinting in the dim torchlight. Despite the heartbreak, the watch required his presence. He went about his duties, grateful that tasks occupied his mind. Over time, the rawness of grief lessened, replaced by a cold determination. He would honor Ned by living on, by keeping the vow that Ned had worked so hard to protect. Perhaps, in time, he could find a way to do more. He would remain watchful, gather information, and wait for the moment that might allow him to serve justice. For now, he had to keep living, keep breathing, even when it hurt. As war broke out in the south, Robb Stark raising the banners of the north, the Lannisters fortifying King's Landing, Renly and Stannis Baratheon each declaring their claim to the throne. Jon remained in the far north, watching from a distance as the realm tore itself apart. Though he ached to be with Robb, to fight for House Stark, he kept to his duty. None guessed that the young man at Castle Black was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, the living embodiment of both the wolf and the dragon. Sometimes, gazing into the distance from atop the wall, Jon Snow felt an emptiness he could not name. He had bound himself to a lifetime of service, all to hide a heritage that might bring ruin to him and those he loved. He told himself it was the right choice. He told himself he had no regrets. But in the solitude of the night, when the wind whispered across the ice, he could almost hear a voice calling from beyond, telling him that the story was not yet done. For though Jon Snow had taken the Black and laid to rest the question of his parentage, fate had a way of unraveling even the tightest secrets. In the darkness beyond the wall, in the wars of the Five Kings, and in the subtle shifting tides of prophecy, events were stirring that would not so easily let the hidden Targaryen rest. And in his dreams, the dragons still roared.